United Nations Hymn. Eagerly, musician, sweep your string, elative, optative, so we may sing, our several voices interblending, playfully contending, not interfering, but co-inhering. For all within the cincture of the sound is holy ground, where all are brothers, none faceless others. Let mortals beware of words, for with words we lie, can say peace when we mean war, foul thoughts speak fair and promise falsely. But song is true. Let music for peace be the paradigm, for peace means to change at the right time as the world's clock goes tick and tock. So may the story of our human city presently move like music when begotten notes new notes beget, making the flowing of time a growing, till it what it could be, at last it is. Where even sadness is a form of gladness, where fate is freedom, grace, and surprise.
Hello, welcome to the UN Day celebration, Creating a Blueprint for a Better Future. I'm Jill Christensen, the chair of the United Nations Association National Capital Area Board. We're so glad that you've made time today. The video you just saw was the words of poet W.H. Auden, and then the music by composer Pablo Casals from a half a century ago. Today, we celebrate the 76th anniversary of the United Nations and the importance of that to the United States. So welcome. You know, the need for the United Nations is greater now than ever before. Climate crisis, COVID-19 global pandemic, migration and humanitarian crisis. We have the Sustainable Development Goals. We'll be talking about them today, the important international goals that impact national level, international level, but also then in the local community. Thank you so much to our sponsors. You saw their names listed just a moment ago, as well as in the corporations and companies that are with us as well. All that support is important for vital engagement in the United Nations and the well-being of the United Nations Association. So, members, we're very glad you're here. You're not a member, is that what I heard? Well, this is your opportunity. We would love to have you join membership of the United Nations Association National Capital Area. And in that, have access to our great committee work, our wonderful events, and other activities. Glad you're here today. You know, we're going to start with, in fact, delivering the United Nations Association National Capital Area Award, which is the Edison W Advocacy Award, specifically for leadership. Now, let me tell you a little bit about this guy named Eddie Dick. He has been around international circles and impacted in great ways. He, in fact, was a founding member of the Advocacy Committee for the United Nations Association United States office from 2000 to 2007. He was president of our national chapter for 3 years in the 1990s, but he served also then on our board and also on the World Federation of the United Nations Associations. Eddie is still active today in our advocacy committee. And truly, he is someone who has a robust, full understanding of the importance of the United States engagement in the United Nations. It's a great honor today to give this award to United States Senator Ben Cardin of Maryland. Since the award was incepted in 2017, Eddie Dick has received it, Representative Barbara Lee of California has received it, as well as Senator Chris Van Hollen. But I want to tell you a little bit as far as how we've built out our advocacy and work within the United Nations Association, of which Senator Cardin has been a part. First off, we're building, in fact, activity and actions within each one of our committees so that advocacy is visible, whether one's looking at human rights, peace and security, international law, advocacy is there. And also then developing tools and materials for engagement so that we can not only share with our members, but also our elected leaders why the United States should be involved in the United Nations, and then what is going on that's of value to us. Well, our recipient, Senator Ben Cardin, he's been a member of the Senate since 2007, serving on the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations. Currently, he's chair of the subcommittee that oversees the State Department, USAID, bilateral international development, as well as international operations. He also serves as chair of the Senate Small Business Committee. Senator Cardin, you truly are a friend of the United Nations Association of the National Capital Area and of this nation. You've been there as we've sought funding for UN operations, for peacekeeping, for the UN Population Fund. You've hosted advocacy meetings, meeting with us personally, as well as in having your staff meet with us. You've presented at Members Day at the United Nations, organized by the United Nations Association. Yes, there were a few strategy meetings on what to do if the United States under the former administration would pull out of the Human Rights Council. It is wonderful, and we celebrate the United States is back within the UN Human Rights Council. On SDGs, you've been a champion, the Sustainable Development Goals, and particularly then 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions. We'll talk more about the SDGs later in the program. All kinds of international initiatives you have taken on, whether that has to do with calling for the UN to step up more with Burma, to address then expelling UN workers from Ethiopia, supporting over years the US engagement and ensuring that we are a part of the Paris Agreement. We're back. And then, of course, looking at COVID-19 and what our responsibilities are within the United States to ensure that the UN and our international partners are as well engaged and supported as possible. You know, here domestically, so much of your initiatives fit right with the Sustainable Development Goals and that whole variable of what happens at home, whether we're talking affordable housing within Build Back Better, or the Chesapeake watershed, or then with USCIS and ensuring that Afghans who come in as parolees have their fees waived. Senator Cardin, thank you for your international advocacy. I do not have the actual plaque to give you. It's coming, we promise. In this virtual environment, you're going to get it in your real hands. But we're thrilled to have you with us. We are thrilled to have you as a partner in advocacy and leadership and continue to working with you. So you are a part of the blueprint for a better future. The floor is yours.
Well, Jill, first of all, thank you for that just beautiful remarks. I appreciate it. But more importantly, thank you for your extraordinary leadership at the United Nations Association, the National Capital Area. We are so proud. You're one of the strongest the arms of the United Nations Association. So we very proud of the work that you do and all of your members. So thank you. And it's a real honor to be recognized with an award named after Edison Dick, who is legendary in his leadership, his just lay leadership on behalf of public diplomacy and world engagement. You know, we're all fighting these days for public diplomacy, for the importance of a strategic, coordinated global response to the challenges that we have, and that's what the United Nations represent. And that's why your work is so vitally important. We know we have so many challenges today, and every day it seems like there are even more. COVID-19 added an additional dimension to our existing challenges, dealing with poverty, dealing with safety, the migration issues, conflict. There's so many different areas that we're engaged in, and your work helps us. U.S. leadership is vitally important. And we did have a rough time during the past administration, but thanks to your efforts and thanks to the advocacy community here in the United States, we remained engaged during that period of time. And if you look at the action in the United States Congress and the Senate and the House, even though we had a president that was hostile, and even though the Congress was controlled by his party, we were still able to maintain critical action in the Congress to support our global mission in the United Nations. I just want to applaud you on your agenda, building a blueprint for a better tomorrow. And thank you for mentioning the Sustainable Development Goals. I am a big fan of the Sustainable Development Goals. To me, it's been one of the great successes of the United Nations. And I know we have Administrator Steiner here, and I thank him for his professional leadership. We need to do a better job in letting the people of America know what we've been able to accomplish already under the Sustainable Development Goals and the Millennium Development Goals. It set up an agenda to really deal with the most vulnerable in our world, to deal with poverty, to deal with gender equity, to deal with core health issues and nutrition issues and housing issues. And we set guides to make sure that we were accomplishing our goals. And we did accomplish those goals. We did make significant inroads in dealing with these global problems. And it was through the UN leadership with the Sustainable Development Goals that we were able to get a focus of the global community in a strategy where the stakeholders joined us, whether they were governmental entities or whether they were NGOs, in order to show that we could, yes, make a major difference on our environment, we can make a major difference on health, we can make a major difference on poverty and gender equality. So I'm just so proud of the work we've done under the SDGs. And thank you for mentioning the 2030 SDGs, which are 17 in number, but number 16 is the one I'm the most proud of because it's sort of unorthodox. It's not part of what we've done in the past because it's a good governance issue. And it was President Biden who observed that corruption is a core national security concern. Why? Because good governance is critically important for protecting the people that they govern. So yes, we are concerned to make sure that we have peace, justice, and strong institutions. And now we are focused on that with SDG 16. So I've been working to get the United States to be a stronger financial partner in the implementation. The request has been made that we provide $50 million to the UN Joint Fund for Sustainable Development. I'm all for that. I hope we can get that done. I've made that request. I know it's going to be a challenge to do this in 1 year, but we're going to try because I think it's that important. I do want to just underscore again that under the Biden administration, we are taking up good governance. I've introduced legislation that would rank every country in the world on how well they're doing to fight corruption, which is it's so tragic when you have wealth in a country or you provide humanitarian aid to a country and it's diverted to corrupt leaders. We want to rate every country as how well they're doing, as we do on human trafficking, and then have consequences for those countries that are not doing what they should be doing. One last point before I turn it back to your very important program that you have for your members to this evening. And that is, we are now starting the COP26 meetings in Glasgow, where under the auspices of the United Nations, we're coming together as a global community to deal with one of the great challenges of our time, the climate agenda. And today we had great news in the United States Congress. President Biden announced the framework agreement for the Build Back Better budget, which we believe will unleash the infrastructure bill as well as the reconciliation budget that will provide an unprecedented amount of resources that the United States is going to make available to the global fight to protect our environment from climate change. America is back, and you'll see that in Glasgow. Our leadership will be there. as will our members. I'll be leading a congressional delegation. I did that in COP21 when 10 senators were in Paris. We're going to have a larger number of members of Congress that'll be present in Glasgow to show that America is truly part of the global community, a leader in the global community. And yes, we can avoid the worst consequences of climate change, but we need to be strategic and work together as a global community to do this. And I'm just proud to be part of this. And again, I thank you so much for the honor this evening.
Senator Cardin, thank you so much. Thank you for your leadership on the SDGs. Also then your presence both at COP21 and now 26, leading the charge for the United States as far as what we need to do with climate. Thank you very much. And I want you to stay on if you can today. You're most welcome to, because we're going to be talking a lot about the Sustainable Development Goals, as you know, with Administrator Steiner from UNDP. But also we're going to take a moment here to talk about an initiative, an innovation truly, from the United Nations Association of the National Capital Area. Our colleague and staff member, Shayna Vaser, is the Senior Policy Advisor for Sustainable Development. The Global Goals at Home takes the Sustainable Development Goals, uses a dashboard format to truly have a look at where we are within the goals, within the tactics for the goals, here within the DMV, Washington, DC, Maryland, and Virginia, taking that local look. Cooperating and working with NGOs, nonprofit organizations, companies, faith groups also, they will be able to have, in fact, an analytical look at where we are, where we stand in a geographic layout of, in fact, this general area. It's very innovative. There are a few small handful of cities that are doing this across the United States. In the absence of the United States doing its own reporting on progress of the SDGs, we're hoping that, in fact, this platform can be a model for cities, communities, and states across the country on how we are delivering on these sustainable development goals. With that, what I want to note is that very recently, this project won first place in an international competition. And the competition was called Pioneers for the SDGs. That was, in fact, by the Foundation of Journalists, in the International Foundation of Journalists. And with that, it just gave us great pride that amongst competitors from 20 other nations, this won the first prize for innovations of how to extend the SDGs and make them so that, in fact, they're close to home. So, Global Goals at Home, please meet Shayna Vaser, who will talk about the program. Go for it.
Thank you so much, Jill, for the warm welcome and for the opportunity to take the next 5 minutes or so to introduce you all to the Global Goals at Home program. Because our time today is limited, I have foregone a slide deck in the hopes that this is just the starting point for longer conversations and potential collaboration. We have learned a lot of lessons since March 2020, and one that really resonated with our team at UNA-NCA is how these incredibly complex challenges require interdisciplinary solutions in order to be effective. We know that we can't tackle a public health crisis without understanding how public health relates to climate change, to access to housing and food and employment or resilient infrastructure. And while we were speaking with direct service providers, we consistently heard that the lack of universal standards or framing around key issues, as well as difficulty in accessing or sharing data, was making it incredibly difficult not to then work in silos, especially when paired with the capacity strain under COVID. Now, as members of the United Nations Association, we are of course familiar with the 17 Sustainable Development Goals and how they serve as a global blueprint or agenda for holistic and enduring change. We know that we can't achieve Goal 1, no poverty, without considering the following 16 goals. However, their universal nature, when applied to the United States directly, does not always accurately capture the landscape of critical need here, especially at that municipal or community level. And so we began to build on the model of voluntary national and local reviews to localize each SDG indicator into a proxy measure that is unique to our jurisdiction and report that data across DC, Maryland, and Virginia, and then take it one step farther by contextualizing it through quantitative and qualitative analysis. So when we look at a goal like SDG 16, how do we promote global good governance and access to justice? How does that then manifest here? And how do we specifically measure that? We look at rates of pretrial detention, recidivism, access to legal representation, mass incarceration. We then disaggregated all of our findings by state, by county or ward, by city, and by congressional district. And we built the online dashboard that I'm about to share with each of you to serve as a central hub for information. We wanted to prioritize building a methodology that could be replicated across other jurisdictions. And starting next year, we're going to continue and expand our work with community stakeholders to ensure that the proxy measures we've selected are remaining relevant and applicable. Because at the end of the day, to us, it's not only about filling a data gap or providing common framing or elevating the visibility of the SDGs. This is a resource to create new pathways for inclusive policymaking and for companies within our jurisdiction to map their ESG and sustainability strategies in a way that intentionally consider community level impact. I have to highlight that this is an entirely volunteer, grassroots driven effort, and a real testament to the power of community-led change. The website that I'm about to show you was built by Cameron Hickman, who is an incredibly talented college student and programmer. All of the data and analysis has been provided by incredible researchers over the last year and a half. And we're honored to launch this program with the support of sustainability champions like Cox Communications. Now, without further ado, if you visit globalgoalsathome.org, you'll be taken to our dashboard live as of today. You can already download all of the metadata. So that's the proxy indicators and data for all 17 SDGs for DC, Maryland, and Virginia. That's available for download. And over the course of the next year, we'll continue updating each of these goal areas with that analysis. So right now we can take a look at SDG 1, no poverty, and you'll see a model that's applied to all of the subsequent goals. It starts with a comparative analysis between the 3 states, so we can understand how, not only how the conditions are in Maryland or in Virginia, but how the two compare to one another. What we specifically focused on was looking at the data and seeing what stories are most impactful, what do we feel warrants further exploration, and to really dig into those. To us, it's incredibly vital not just to present numbers without context, but to understand what are the conditions that have created these trends that we're observing. And you'll find on this site a mix of written analysis, a mix of ArcGIS mapping and statistical modeling, so that we also get a very clear visual representation of the remaining questions, the remaining data gaps, and what really warrants further exploration, because here we can see what policies currently work, where do we need more community-led intervention or different policy agenda, and it's incredibly impactful. As you can navigate on the left-hand sidebar, you'll see that the pages are organized by UN target and then UN indicator. But within each indicator page is a representation of the proxies. Now for the official proxy language, that's all documented in the downloadable Excel file. Here, things are grouped by trend. And again, it's incredibly important for us not only to identify that, for example, within the District of Columbia, there is a statistically significant relationship between race and income and geography, but how has the history of our district informed these trends? How does it continue to perpetuate these trends? And what are the opportunities for more progress? It's such an honor to be able to share this with you after starting this project in July of 2020. And this really is just the beginning. I'd love to continue this conversation with each of you. Please get in touch with us at SDGs@UNA-NCA.org to ask any questions or to follow up, so that we can keep working as a community to tackle these issues head on and start addressing some of these gaps within our community. Thank you again for the opportunity to share with each of you. And now it's my pleasure to introduce the president of the United Nations Association of the National Capital Area and chair of the National Council of the United Nations Association, Paula Boland.
Many thanks, Shana, and congratulations to you and the team for the vision and all the good work resulting in this groundbreaking tool that is helping us reimagine how we understand, measure, and create social impact at the local level. Please visit the dashboard, join UNA if you're not yet a member, and get involved in the SDG consultations we will have next year. The 17 United Nations Global Goals for Sustainable Development, SDGs, offer a global agenda for critical transformation. They provide an interconnected blueprint for sustainable and inclusive change, a blueprint for all stakeholders to consider and adapt. The active participation of global civil society, governments, and world leaders is an essential component for the continued success and strength of the United Nations and the collective fulfillment of the SDGs by 2030, as approved by all member states of the UN. For more than 7 decades, UNA members across the country have advocated on behalf of the UN and its agencies. Over the last year and a half, we have been reminded of just how interconnected the world is and that a threat anywhere, from the COVID-19 pandemic to intensifying impacts of climate change, is a threat everywhere. The US should not and cannot tackle global challenges alone. Our members know that creating a blueprint for a better future can only be achieved through working in tandem with the UN. And the UN Development Program, known as UNDP, is at the center of sustainable development and progress, particularly through the SDG framework. Let's just take a quick look at the important work carried out by this agency.
The United Nations Development Programme started with the belief that everyone deserves a chance to live with dignity, opportunity, and safety. In 1966, we set out to tackle challenges that affect billions of people across the globe, from poverty to clean water, from responsible government to women's empowerment. For 50 years, it's been our mission to eliminate poverty in all its forms. But poverty, conflict, and climate change remain huge challenges that threaten millions of people everywhere. At UNDP, we know we can overcome these challenges by targeting their root causes. UNDP's experts work on the ground, hand in hand with communities, governments, and civil society in over 160 countries, finding new and innovative approaches to improve people's lives. We know how to get the job done. Now, for the first time in history, the world has come together with a plan to end extreme poverty and protect the planet from climate change. The Sustainable Development Goals are 17 targets that provide a universal blueprint for future generations to inherit a world without poverty. A plan that gives everyone a fair chance. But we can't do it alone. We need everyone to join together, because we need everyone to finish the job. The United Nations Development Programme and you can build a better future. We can be the first generation to end poverty and the last generation to face the threat of climate change.
It is now my distinct pleasure to introduce our distinguished guest, Achim Steiner of Germany, appointed as administrator of UNDP in 2017 and reappointed for a second term earlier this year. Mr. Steiner is also the vice chair of the UN Sustainable Development Group, which unites 40 entities of the UN system that work to support sustainable development. Over nearly 3 decades, Mr. Steiner has been a global leader on sustainable development, climate resilience, and international cooperation. He has worked tirelessly to champion sustainability, economic growth, and equality for the vulnerable, and has been a vocal advocate for the Sustainable Development Goals. A full bio will be included in the chat box for you. So welcome, Administrator Steiner. Many thanks for joining us for a timely conversation on yours as well as your agency's vision for a better and more sustainable future. So let's just dive in. In your view, what are the primary challenges globally in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals?
Paula, Madam President, as we would say in the General Assembly Hall, let me first of all just give you a first word of gratitude for having invited me to join you today, the National Capital Association of the United Nations Association, to commemorate United Nations Day, and to be able to join and listen just now to Senator Cardin and then Steiner is a true privilege. You cannot imagine how much joy I derive from listening to a senator of the United States Congress speak to the Sustainable Development Goals with the clarity, the passion, and the insight that I just listened to. It's fantastic. And then just a couple of minutes later to listen to Steiner and to see how you have taken these global goals and have done exactly and precisely what its architects had in mind, that this is not a declaration in the abstract, somewhere at a galactic or planetary level only to be understood, but really it is a way in which each one of us can begin to do something about what happens next in our world. So I simply want to thank you, and also my congratulations to you and for awarding Senator Cardin the Edison W. Advocacy Leadership Award. I now fully understand why you chose him, and I hope one day I'll have the privilege to meet him as well. But you wanted me to jump straight in, and so I think in many ways, listening to both Senator Cardin and to Steiner just now, I think they have already laid out precisely both the challenges that we face in the time in which we live. I want to begin with that because these are, first of all, extraordinary times in any case, in the midst of a pandemic, but they are also in some ways epochal times because something like climate change really is without precedent, human-induced, solvable by humans, and yet a threat to the future of humanity. It's as dramatic as that. And I think part of our challenge has been to comprehend quite how significant a threat this is, and yet how central it also is to the future of development. So I lead the United Nations Development Program. The SDGs are, in a sense, the DNA of what we do and think every day. And yet I think it helps to go back one step perhaps, because the genesis of the SDGs in some ways were almost accidental. It was the Rio +20 summit in 2012 that at the last minute thought that the world really needed to evolve beyond these Millennium Development Goals. And one key notion in there that I think sometimes may not be easily understood, but if you turn the SDGs on their head and actually view them as a way of describing the great risks of our time, for which we can only find answers by working together, then you begin to understand why, as Ban Ki-moon, the Secretary General in 2015, called the SDGs actually a declaration of interdependence. And again, Senator Cardin explained already on a number of issues why, already woven into the fabric of the idea of the United Nations, that idea of cooperation was there from day one. But I think the SDGs have given us an agenda for our time. And frankly speaking, we have nothing else at the moment to which 193 nations have signed up and therefore share an understanding of these risks. Now, how do we move forward? Well, first of all, by doing exactly what you have done. The SDGs are a global framework, but at the end of the day, actions begin locally. So we begin to look at our reality because really what each one of us does, that is also an implication in the SDGs, will have an effect on others, sometimes thousands of miles away. It's not just emissions, it's not just pollution or climate change. It could be violent extremism, it could be inequality, it could be the associated phenomena of radicalization and terror that begin to affect us in a global context, even though the origins may be attributed to one place, one country. And I think the great chance we have right now is that, first of all, the SDGs provide us with a sense of being able to act in unison. Difficult as it is in a geopolitical world that has so many divisions, nevertheless, we agree that these are things on which we have to work together, whether we are developing or developed countries, East or West. This is an opportunity on which to coalesce and to cooperate. And I think that has to start also with citizens. If we as citizens do not believe that the SDGs have anything to do with our daily lives, then it's very difficult for politicians, for senators, members of the House, to in fact try to work on those principles. And for us as a development organization, and I am very proud to lead the United Nations Development Program, which is really the organization with the greatest presence around the world, it is also about connecting brilliant ideas and innovation and solutions. Development work in the 21st century is not only about poverty. Yes, it is about eradicating poverty, but it is actually about the future of development, about the possibilities of that digital frontier that has suddenly moved forward by 5 or 10 years in the pandemic, that opens up enormous opportunities for inclusion, designing support programs, designing partnerships also with the private sector to enable women who for the first time in their lives are able to transact money on a smartphone because they could never get a bank account. That is where the SDGs suddenly translate into life-changing impacts. But let me turn back to you. You know that I can talk a lot for a long time about these things.
And we can be here listening to you with great interest, and you're giving us wonderful example of how the SDGs are really realized at the local level. We often talk about what needs to be done in the developing world, but can you speak of what roles and responsibilities rich countries have? Are they living up to their responsibilities?
Well, I think as always in, whether it is around a local community, a village, whether it is a nation or it is a global family, so to speak, of 193 nations that are member states of the UN, I think the first and most important point is to understand that we have a shared interest. We can always invoke the normative, solidarity, responsibility, the ability to help those who are less well off than we may be. But I think in the context of multilateralism, the United Nations and the time we live in, let's begin with a very simple principle. We have a shared interest in working with one another. And that means that those who are wealthier, better off, more able to act, can also invest in the ability of others to achieve that kind of development that they seek. And I think that is the beginning of a, obviously very complex story of inequality in our world today. That is less and less perhaps just North and South, because the phenomena of inequality are beginning to really permeate middle-income countries. For instance, UNDP today is a development program that uses its development financing principally for least developed countries, but it actually works in 170 countries because many middle-income countries are confronted with the challenge of inequality, of rapid transitions, of achieving a kind of inclusive development that sometimes is at risk when you have rapid economic growth, urbanization. But let me take that question to something very specific that Senator Cardin also addressed at the beginning. We're about to go to Glasgow, the Conference of the Parties on Climate Change. Now, to many, the epitome of a world not acting, to me, the long and patient story of bringing the world together around one table to do something that has never been done in human history, namely to transform our economies together in sync, and to do so by helping each other. We are debating in Glasgow right now this sum of $100 billion that the wealthier nations of the world had committed to developing countries in order to help them to accelerate their investments in clean energy, in decarbonizing their economies. That promise was made in 2009, it was repeated again in 2015, and it still hasn't been fulfilled. And that is a tragic fact, not only for the countries that are still waiting for that support, but it's a missed opportunity, because we often think that development finance or climate finance is a kind of charity. It's a donation, and the other ones are not going to do anything if I don't give them the money. The truth is, developing countries are already being forced to invest hundreds of billions of dollars in adapting to climate change from their own budgets. That's just money spent to stay in the same place where they are. And then they're expected to essentially leapfrog into a clean energy economy, clean energy or clean mobility. And here, the idea of these 100 billion is really, it's a co-investment, because hundreds of billions of dollars of developing country funds will actually be accelerated in the right direction by virtue of the wealthier world co-investing. So there are many logics to wealthier countries working with poorer countries, less and less charity, more and more shared interest, and more an opportunity to do something that in the case of climate change really is without precedent.
What a tremendous opportunity indeed. And I am hopeful that the Biden administration will step up. We know that Senator Cardin and others are working to get that increased support from the United States. This is, in the words of President Biden, a historical moment, a really critical time in our history to take action and avert the effects of climate change. So a logical question to ask you is, we know the answer, but we wanted to elaborate more about how COVID-19 has hurt the progress towards the SDGs, and it has altered, in your opinion, the path for achieving them by 2030.
Well, I think we can all sense, whether it is in Washington, D.C., here in New York City, or in New Delhi, or wherever in the world, COVID-19 has been a terrible setback. I mean, hundreds of millions of jobs lost, an extraordinary amount of indebtedness, millions of people who, have died, and the continued specter of essentially poverty coming back with a vengeance. So many people are today falling below the poverty line again. And all the gains of recent years are in danger, because essentially that social and economic impact of COVID-19 has a very long tail. Now, we may sometimes feel like when you live in the United States or perhaps in a European country, that when you look at the economic recovery rates, that actually this was just a bump along the way. But the truth is, it's not. We will feel the impacts of COVID-19 for years to come, also in the wealthier countries. But for developing countries, it's an absolute shock. The fiscal space, first of all, that countries had available, the amount of public funding that they could mobilize to put these kinds of stabilization measures, social safety mechanisms into place, cash transfers, help people, help businesses that were going bankrupt, was a fraction of that which developed or richer countries could deploy. And we're now talking about a $14 trillion COVID-19 stimulus package. And yet the harsh truth is, much of that was in the wealthier countries. For many developing countries, COVID-19 will for years become a real shackle on their recovery. And we see it even in the statistics now. For least developed countries, the projection for the coming year is a recovery in terms of economic growth of maybe 0.5 to 1%. Developed countries are already on a 5% trajectory of recovery. That's tenfold speed gain. And so COVID-19 will create greater inequality again globally. And then for us as UNDP and the United Nations family, also in particular within countries, how can we assist countries who already have very little public funding left to deal, for example, with a reality that 50% of the world's population has no social protection in today's world, and most of them are in developing countries. And there it is, the fact that 70, 80% of people earn their livelihoods, their living in the informal sector. So one of the things we confronted during the pandemic was that these lockdowns, the very measures to contain the virus, were actually also really condemning people to starvation, because they live from the daily income of their business, whether it's a workshop or a corner shop, and you suddenly lock that down, there is no income and there is no state financing. Even though in many developing countries, we saw very brave acts of public measures being put in place and the international community stepped up. But for now, that social and economic impact still continues to haunt many millions of people. And you have seen also with the vaccine, again, we knew that this could become a moment of great inequality and unfairness. And initially, that's exactly what happened. We could not obtain the funds from the international community to put the United Nations, at least alongside others at the front of the queue, to purchase vaccines. So we had to go to the back of the queue for lack of funding. And we essentially found ourselves in a world where in wealthier countries today, 2/3, sometimes 70% of people are vaccinated. In least developed countries, we are still below 5%. And here is where the circle closes again. This pandemic will not be over until it is over everywhere. So yet another demonstration of how important it is that we find a way to act in unison and in solidarity with one another.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Going back to climate and knowing the formidable challenges that the world faces of climate catastrophe, we continue on this path of inaction. What specific climate actions UNDP is prioritizing? And perhaps you can also comment on the role of youth and the recent people's vote on this.
Well, let me start by saying we've actually even enlisted a extraordinary new employee called Frankie the Dino. So to those of you who have seen Frankie, I urge you to go to don'tchooseextinction.com and you will meet an extraordinary ally who just addressed the UN General Assembly on precisely this issue. But this is just one way in which we are trying to help the world, for instance, take the issue of fossil fuel subsidies and understand that spending currently $423 billion in subsidizing the consumption of fossil fuels is a very irrational, both in economic efficiency terms, but also in terms of the action on climate change way of spending taxpayers' money. And often the argument is used that we need to make sure that the poor have access to energy. Well, the IMF, the World Bank, and basically most economists will tell you that fossil fuel subsidies primarily help the wealthier and better off because they are the principal consumers of larger quantities of fossil fuels. The poor could be supported in a much more targeted way. But what these $423 billion have done is to essentially send a signal into markets, financial markets, technology markets, to continue along a fossil fuel-based energy infrastructure when really we should be leaping forward. So bringing issues such as this that are part of the national development budget, planning and economic thinking is something that we do as UNDP, but we have also done very practical things along the last 2 years. For instance, the Paris Agreement essentially depends on one fundamental mechanism, and that is every 5 years, countries are supposed to update their national climate strategies, these NDCs as they're called, in order to catch up with where the science is telling us we actually need to be. Now, we spent the last 2 years with the UNDP Climate Promise committing to support at least 100, and it turned out to be 120 countries in updating their national climate strategies, and now enabling them to come to Glasgow with that commitment of raised ambition. And I'm very pleased to say that as of, I think, a couple of days ago, 173 countries have submitted their NDCs. So a vital part of that Paris Agreement is beginning to work, namely that we are continuously raising the level of ambition, because every other report that you will hear continues to tell us that we are failing to act fast enough. And then we do some very practical things. And part of our new strategic plan that was just adopted by our board for the next 4 years has an extraordinarily ambitious commitment in it, namely that in the next 4 years, UNDP will support 500 million people to gain access to clean energy. I know many will raise an eyebrow, many will doubt it, and frankly speaking, it is to some extent a moonshot, but it is the expression of a commitment by UNDP that these are not normal times. And if an institution with 20,000 staff around the world working in 170 countries does not change gear and embraces this challenge of essentially moving to a clean energy economy, then we are failing not only in our mandate, we are failing future generations. And so for us, these are the kinds of measures that now will become a centerpiece of a development agenda, because access to energy for 600 million Africans is still, or electricity rather, is still not a reality. So development and shifting to a clean energy economy are perfectly aligned. And we will play our part, for instance, through mini grids that we are now helping to develop in 18 countries across Africa, in order to enable people to gain access to affordable and clean electricity.
That's very exciting and something to look for, as ambitious as it sounds. I know the commitment and the work is already underway. Can you briefly comment on the role of youth and how you see them mobilizing to advance the SDGs, including climate, of course?
Well, first of all, I think our youth deserves a lot of credit and a lot of respect for the insightfulness and the interest they have taken in this issue. Now, naturally, it is their future and one would hope that they would, but it is not something one should take for granted. And I think if you look across the world today, I would consider young people the key variable in terms of what happens next with climate change. They are truly the generation that can actually shift the way we think about the future, whether it is around the dinner table at home, in schools, in their communities, as activists or as innovators, as startup entrepreneurs. I mean, the means by which you can make a difference is endless. But one thing is very troubling, because much of what our young people hear from us today, including the United Nations regularly, is that we are failing them in the way that the world is moving to address something like climate change or inequality, really is not anymore justifiable by absolute constraints. We know what to do, we can afford to do it, and we should be doing it. And I think the difference that they are making right now as young people is to take that conversation essentially into the public realm and challenging established wisdom, complacency, arrogance, vested interests. These are all the variables that slow us down. And for me, they are today the driving force. And I think the reason also why we are seeing the world step up with commitments now that even 2-3 years ago, before this pandemic hit us, some of us would have not dared to think are realistic. And yet we are now seeing change on a scale that is probably without precedent.
Thank you. And to close, I'd like to ask you, are you optimistic? What is your shared vision for a sustainable, better future?
You know, Paula, I think when you join the United Nations, you have to, by definition and by DNA, carry a gene of optimism in you, because so often what you might hear in a 24-hour cycle of news could lead you to the opposite. But I am an optimist, and I, just talked about young people. I think they are one reason why I'm actually optimistic. And secondly, I also see around the world, and this is one of the great privileges of leading an organization like UNDP, I meet people every day. I have encounters. I see their work. I see how millions of people are making an extraordinary difference to what happens next. And that is, the resource on which we can count. What our role is as an institution like UNDP is to support them, facilitate them, connect them to others, make them part of a global innovation community that can both challenge debates at national level, but also draw inspiration from others. And in that sense, yes, Paula, I am an optimist, but a slightly paranoid one, because time is not on our side. The clock is ticking on climate change, on inequality. It's tearing many of our societies apart. We need to act with more consequence.
Absolutely, very well said. The time is now. I wish we had more time, Akim. It's been such a pleasure. Dankeschön. Thank you so much for sharing your vision for the future and for your inspiring leadership of UNDP. We really look forward to continue supporting the work of your agency as well as others in the United Nations system and helping realize the SDGs, both at the global and local levels. Thank you so much to you and your staff. Remember that we're here to be the movement, the advocates, to show Americans and beyond the important work of the UN on the ground. So you're welcome to stay for the remaining part of the program. And again, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And happy United Nations Day.
And happy United Nations Day. Yes. Back to our audience. I hope you have enjoyed so far the inspiring remarks from Senator Cardin, very well deserved serving of the Edison Advocacy Leadership Award, as well as this most informative and engaging conversation with Achim Steiner. And now we want to give you an opportunity to provide feedback. So we're going to be putting on the screen a few polling questions for you to share some of your vision for the future. You have a single choice for each one of these questions, and we will show you the results. Are we ready? Most participants indicated all of the above, not surprisingly, but also right behind that, a lack of political will. Let's go to the next. How can the challenges of sustainable development be overcome? Single choice. Let's show the results. All right. By having the US work with the United States system, and that's what I would expect from this audience. We are members, supporters, or prospective members of the UN Association, and this is very much the core of our mission. Next. What is the main issue, challenge that deserves priority attention within the SDGs? We know these are all important challenges, but what is that one that you think needs to be tackled right away? And let's show the results. All of the above, followed by climate and poverty and inequalities. Well, thank you so much. We had other questions prepared for you, but in the interest of time, I'm going to now move to thank you all again for joining us this evening. And a reminder that it is the 76th anniversary of the UN. Whether it is standing for human rights, eliminating extreme poverty, putting an end to human trafficking, combating climate change, or protecting refugees, the UN is working to build a better future by confronting the planet's most complex challenges. But we all know and must recognize that it can't do it alone. While the UN is standing up for the world, we are standing up for the UN. And we do that through our chapter's work and in our communities, through education and advocacy. UNA, the entire UNA family is bigger, bolder, and better because of our members, their advocacy and dedication to supporting the life-saving work of the United Nations. As President Biden said in his UN Day proclamation this year, we are at an inflection point in history. The choices we make in the next few years, whether or not come together to face our greatest global challenges, will determine our future for decades to come. Let us remember that our determination and faith in a better future laid the groundwork for the creation of the United Nations 76 years ago. Now, in a new century, we must work with allies and partners to strengthen the United Nations, to effectively and efficiently tackle the challenges that defy political borders and geographical boundaries today. Our movement of building a strong US-UN partnership has never been more critical. So thank you. Thank you for what you do every day to help us advance this mission. We will now close today's program with South Korean soprano Young-guk Shin singing Il Baccio or Bacchio at this year's UN Day concert. Thank you again and happy United Nations Day.